In a secret facility outside the city of Harbin, a man is giving orders. Burn every document, blow up every building, and the prisoners who are inside these facilities, kill them all. Within a few hours, one of the largest covert research facilities is reduced to rubble and ash. The evidence is gone, the witnesses are gone, and the man giving this order returns to Japan after faking his own death. Now I want you to think about what a man has to have done to fake his own death. Everything I'm going to tell you is what he was doing inside that secret facility and how he got away with it. His name was Shiro Ishii, and this is the story of Unit 731. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in a small village in Japan. He was brilliant and obsessive about medicine. He got his medical degree and joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a medical officer. He began building a reputation as one of the most ambitious doctors in the military. It was an unremarkable beginning for someone who would go on to commit some of the worst crimes in the history of science. To understand what he was up to, you first need to understand a single moment. A day in 1925 that changed the direction of his life entirely. In 1925, the major powers of the world together signed something called the Geneva Protocol. The world had just come out of World War I, a war where poison gas had been extensively used to kill thousands of soldiers and civilians. It was so horrific that all the nations came together and said, certain weapons are now banned. Biological weapons, chemical weapons. No matter how bad a war gets, these will be off the table. For most countries, this agreement felt something like a relief. But there was one man who had a different perspective on this, Shiro Ishii. His logic was this, and follow it carefully because it matters. If the most powerful nations on earth decide that a category of weapon should be banned, then that weapon must be insanely effective. You don't ban something useless, you don't hold international summits over something that doesn't work. The very existence of this agreement to Ishii was proof that biological weapons were the most devastating thing a military could possess, and so he felt Japan should definitely have them. He started lobbying the Japanese army to get funding. He told them it was cheap, cheaper than building tanks and warships. A single naval destroyer would cost more than a country's defense budget. But bacteria? Bacteria could be grown in a lab. Bacteria could move through water supply, food and air. You could devastate an entire army, an entire city for a fraction of the cost. And Japanese army loved the idea. Now while all of this was happening, Japan itself was changing fast. By the early 1900s, Japan went from a feudal isolated nation into one of the most powerful armies in the world. They had won a war against Russia. Russia, one of the largest empires on earth, and Japan had defeated them. They were also looking at countries like Britain and France who had spent 2 centuries colonizing Asia. If the West could build empires by taking land and stealing resources, Japan believed they could do the same. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeast China. Within weeks, Manchuria had fallen and a puppet government was formed to extract everything the region had, especially coal and iron. 6 years later in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion on China. Cities fell and the Chinese government fled the capital. What happened over the next 6 weeks is one of the most brutal atrocities of the century. Japanese soldiers entered the city of Nanjing and started executing civilians. They were killed in mass groups and bodies were burned. An estimated 300,000 people were killed. It is still known today as the Nanjing Massacre, and it remains one of the darkest chapters in Chinese history. While the world was horrified by what Japanese soldiers were doing in Nanjing, Shiro Ishii was quietly building something in the outskirts of Manchuria. And this thing he was building would eventually make even the Nanjing Massacre look like it's just the beginning of the story. In 1932, Ishii was given his first secret facility with a high-level mission to research about biological weapons. But on the inside, it was much more than a research station. By 1936, the program had scaled up. The Japanese king Hirohito authorized its full expansion. Ishii was given unlimited funding and something that no institution in the world would ever provide. an endless supply of human test subjects. A new facility was now constructed in the Pingfang district outside the city of Harbin. The official name was Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Quantum Army, but unofficially, it was known to the world as Unit 731. Before we look into the facility, we have to understand how the people were brought here. The Japanese army dragged people off the streets, loaded them onto the trucks and brought them to the facility. Chinese civilians were the majority, but there were also Koreans, Mongolians and Russian prisoners captured during the war. They were brought into the facility through a secret tunnel running under the main building. Once they went inside, the doctors took blood samples and measured organ function. If someone was deemed healthy enough to be useful, they were assigned a 3-digit number. That number was all they were from that moment. Now the researchers at Unit 731 had a word for people inside those cells. They didn't call them prisoners or subjects or patients. They called them maruta. It's a Japanese word which means wooden logs. That is how the people inside were treated, as raw materials, something to use and then burn. Manchuria winters are brutal. Temperatures drop well below freezing point for months at a time. And then, the Japanese army had a very practical problem. The soldiers were developing severe frostbite in the field, losing fingers, toes and sometimes even entire limbs. And so they wanted to understand how frostbites worked and most importantly, how to treat it fast. A doctor at Unit 731 named Yoshimura Hisato decided to find the answer. Prisoners were taken outside in the middle of the winter. Their arms and legs were submerged in buckets of ice water and held there until the limb was completely frozen. A layer of ice would form over the skin and if you struck the frozen arm with a cane, it would make the same sound as hitting a plank of wood. Then he tested different methods of defrosting, with hot water, open flame and leaving the subject completely untreated overnight. When the limb was frozen and defrosted over and over until it became useless for testing, they would simply amputate it. Some of them had limb cut off and then surgically reattached to the opposite side of the body, the left arm connected to where right arm was. Others had their circulation deliberately cut off so they could watch how gangrene developed in real time. A witness also described that Yoshimura was conducting frostbite experiments on 3-day-old infants. Now the frostbite experiments were not an exception, they were just one of the procedures. Let me tell you about the centrifuge experiments. People were placed inside large centrifuges. These are spinning devices generally used to separate liquids of different densities. The centrifuge was then spun at increasing speeds. Somewhere between 10 to 15 times the force of gravity, the human inside would die. Then there is part of Unit 731 that is hardest to describe. Prisoners were infected with diseases like cholera, plague and typhoid. They were then checking how the disease progressed through the body. When they wanted to study exactly what a disease was doing to a particular organ, say a liver or a kidney, they couldn't wait for the person to die first. Because when a person dies, the body starts changing immediately. Tissues degrade within hours. The picture you see in a dead body is not the same as what disease looks like while it is actively destroying a living one. So the only way to get accurate data by their logic was to operate on a person while they are still alive. Cut them open, remove the organ, examine at the exact moment of peak infection.
The surgery had to be done while the body was still alive. We couldn't use anesthesia. It would have contaminated the results.
There is one more category of experiments that I have to tell you about. Female prisoners of childbearing age were forcibly made pregnant. I am not specifically describing the methods, but it is what you're thinking. Once pregnant, they became a specific research category. They were exposed to biological diseases, chemical agents and physical trauma like gunshots. This was to study how things affected not just the mother, but also the fetus. At various stages of pregnancy, women were cut open. The fetus was removed and examined alongside the mother's organs. The stated purpose according to surviving documentation was to benefit civilian medicine, to understand trauma in pregnancy so Japanese doctors could help mothers and babies in hospitals. Every experiment in the last chapter, all of it, was preparation for something bigger. Because Unit 731 was not at its core a research institution, it was a weapons factory. And by 1939, Ishii believed that they were ready to test what they had built. Here's how the plague weapon was developed. It's the same disease that killed 1/3 of Europe during the Black Death in the Middle Ages. People inside were infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for plague. As prisoners fell sick, the researchers monitored them. The ones who got sickest the fastest, who showed the most rapid, most violent progression of the disease, were the ones they wanted. They were brought to the mortuary table and bled out. Their infected blood was used to infect the next group of prisoners. With every generation, the bacteria was becoming more and more lethal. They were selectively breeding a plague strain and even optimizing it. When a prisoner at the bleeding table was too weak to produce enough blood on their own, the officer climbed on the table and jumped down the victim's chest to bleed him out. When the strain was ready, the infected person was exposed to a massive number of fleas. Fleas are the natural carrier of plague in the wild. When the fleas fed on the prisoners, they were carefully collected and sealed inside a ceramic bomb casing. Each casing held approximately 30,000 infected fleas. Japanese bombers flew over Kuzhou, a city in China, and dropped these bombs. In just a few hours, the flea bites had started, everywhere all at once and across the whole city. Within a few days, plague had spread through the city. More than 2,000 people died in Kuzhou. It also spread to a nearby city called Iwu, and another 2,000 had died there. Again, it was not just plague. Different diseases were spread in the same way, and approximately 7,000 innocent people, or even more, had been killed. Between 1940 and 1942, biological attacks were carried out across multiple cities in China. More recent research estimates the total number of Chinese civilians killed by Japan's biological war was over 500,000 people. Near the end of the war, with Japan facing almost certain defeat, Ishii planned something, if carried out, would have changed the history of 12th century. It was called the Operation's Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was to drop plague-infected bombs across America. The target date was September 22, 1945, but 5 weeks earlier, America dropped atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, swept into Manchuria in the final days of war. That is when Shiro Ishii gave the order to burn every document, blow up every building, and execute every prisoner inside the facility. And then he faked his own death and disappeared into Japan. He thought he had gotten away with everything he had done. But then, it got worse.
On an occasion to which reference has and will be made, Hitler, the leader of the Nazi conspirators, who are now on trial before you, I shall give a propagandist cause for starting the war.
In Europe, the Nuremberg trials had begun. Nazi leaders, military commanders, and doctors were prosecuted. 16 doctors who had conducted experiments on prisoners were convicted. 7 of them were sentenced to death. Now let me tell you what actually happened in the Pacific. In the autumn of 1945, an American microbiologist named Murray Sanders arrived in Japan. He had been sent by General Douglas MacArthur to investigate what Unit 731 had produced. Sanders interviewed the surviving researchers, reviewed what little evidence was left, and pieced together what had happened. He confirmed the human experiments and took his findings to MacArthur. MacArthur's response, according to Sanders, was,
"We need more evidence. Keep going. Ask more questions. And keep quiet about it."
Over the following months, the American military hardened into something deliberate because the Cold War was beginning. The US and the Soviet Union were competing against each other across every dimension: military, technology, and science. And the Americans had a problem. They wanted biological warfare data, the kind that could only be produced by experimenting on humans, which American law, ethics, and medical standards made it impossible to replicate. But they knew Unit 731 had the data. Years of it, thousands of humans worth of it. On May 6, 1947, MacArthur sent a classified cable to the US War Department, which confirmed that Shiro Ishii had acknowledged the human experiments. And Ishii said, if guaranteed immunity from war crime prosecution, he would describe the entire program in complete detail. And so, the deal was made. The US paid immunity and money in exchange for approximately 8,000 preserved human tissue slides and their reports.
The Unit 731 data. It was absolutely invaluable to us, because a breakdown of that nature could never have been achieved in American labs. We have certain scruples, you see, when it comes to human experimentation. They had a clean slate. We couldn't afford to let that research go to waste.
Japan, on the other hand, said Unit 731 did not even exist. They were officially saying this never happened. But after so many years in 2002, a Japanese court ruled for the first time that Japan had conducted biological warfare during World War II. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Until the next video, take care.